everyone, and welcome to the Peachy Archaeogamer. My name is Peach, and this is the first ever episode of the Peachy Archaeogamer. So thank you for tuning in. I'm currently a student of archaeology over at SAUE, and I am an absolute nerd. I love all kinds of Dungeons and Dragons. I love video games. Recently, I've been getting into Halo, Kingdom Hearts, things like that. So I'm kind of hoping through this podcast I am able to share my love and knowledge about archaeology and video games and gaming in general, and the mixture of that, which is called archaeogaming. And today I'm hoping, after a quick definition, to go into classic video games in their golden age and to take a look at it through an archaeological lens. So, what even is archaeogaming? Archaeogaming is a subfield of archaeology that studies the material culture of the material and immaterial aspects of games. So, like a game, digital or not, is treated both as an artifact and a site. So, games can range from board games to tabletop role playing games to video games. And we look at them as if they're an artifact. If we do that, it's like looking at Nintendo consoles throughout the ages and how the NES transformed into the Nintendo Switch. And it could be literal archaeology, finding artifacts like the old E.T. Atari games buried in the New Mexico desert. So if we look at them as sites, we can analyze like different. We could literally look at different pottery inside different games. So like Elder Scrolls has pottery that changes throughout each of their games. It can also look at archaeologists as characters and NPCs or non-playable characters, or just archaeology in games in general. Example of this is Lara Croft in Tomb Raider, and there's xenoarchaeology in the Halo games, and how archaeology is used as a way to enhance or enrich a plot. Another form of archaeogaming is the archaeology of the narrative. This type of archaeology is a way of describing new forms of writing, art, discourse, information dispersion, and narrative. Video games that always seem to get the short ends of the stick when it comes to narrative studies are classic video games during the golden age period of video games specifically. So this is when arcade games basically dominated the market, and home consoles such as the Atari 2600 were just getting their feet under them. And the reason that these classic games get swept to the side is because their narratives aren't glaringly obvious. Like modern games today, you have games that have rich story and multiple choices and just this big sandbox of a world. But we can take games such as Space Invaders or Namco's Galaxin. These games, they don't focus on storytelling. They mostly just want you to put another quarter in the machine and try again. And this worked in the time, and it still sort of works today if you can find an arcade that's still open. This is a form of a narrative called like a closed and complete narrative. So this is where only one way for the story to begin and end. You insert a quarter, fight enemies to the best of your abilities, and you lose. You can insert another quarter, or you can try your luck again another time. There is a Archaeogamer named Michael Zalet who wrote a good paper about this. He has far more experience in archaeology and gaming than I do. He created a 3-part model for looking at the narrative of these games. The first part of his model looks at the contextual narrative by looking at how games reference other text, and how it's presented across media, and how it's reconstructed and expanded upon. Basically, it's how the game acknowledges the world and how the world sort of acknowledges it. The second part of his model looks at in-game narrative, so basically the story that the game is portraying. There's not a lot of that in classic Golden Age games, but you do see it in Pac-Man later. And then finally, there is experimental narrative, which is how players consumed and reacted to games, and how the game essentially impacted the public. When you look at classic video games, from this perspective, there's a lot of interesting things to find. Video games have always included contextual narratives since the dawn of the Golden Age. Space Invaders featured aliens that the player could shoot, and this game is essentially a reworking of the 1976 Atari game Breakout. And it also used music that would create a sense of tension and dread while playing. If you have the chance, go ahead and pause this podcast and go listen to it. It freaked me out even listening to it, even though I didn't grow up with this game. The music starts off with like a low, steady rhythm that's only broken up by the sound of your ship shooting. The longer the time goes on, the faster the music becomes, and the faster the enemies are at moving to the side and moving closer to you. And the music's supposed to be a nod to the theme Jaws from 1975. Just like how the shark draws near, the music gets faster, so does the enemies of this game. And there's other arcade games that also allude to other media. There was Star Battle, which uses imagery from Star Wars, such as their TIE fighters and X-Wings. And if memory serves correct, I believe also the images from the Death Star. There were some games that even reference real historical events, like Atari's Missile Command and Irene's Red Alert. It referenced both the Cold War and the Red Scare, respectively. And that's just how games inside themselves reference others. But then these games also got to expand their media. So Pac-Man is very interesting. It is actually the first game that was able to have its own TV show, which I was not. I watched Pac-Man as a kid. I didn't know it was the first video game TV show. He had toys, he had lunchboxes, and it just expanded the ways games can get revenue. Um, and then Atari's Sword Quest, which I didn't know about until researching this. Apparently, when you bought Sword Quest, it came with a little comic book that you had to use to solve puzzles of the game. So if you had lost that comic book, your game was essentially obsolete because it just doesn't. You can't solve the puzzles without the book, which I found very interesting. I love when games do things like that and make you go on quests outside of the game. Um, but moving on, there's the second part of the model that looks at in-game narratives that already exist within elements of the story. There's not much that has done that. I can think of three through my research. So home consoles had the luxury of making games that you didn't have to lose constantly. You could take your time with it. So Atari did that with Pitfall first. It was 20 minutes long, which is very short for modern standards, but back then, most games you were supposed to play for maybe 3 minutes at max. So this, you were supposed to sit down, you're supposed to enjoy, and probably play again and again. This one, instead of having that closed loop where you have the start and the end, you have 3 lives. And so there are 3 possible endings. You could lose your 3 lives. You could run out of time, which your time limit was 20 minutes, or you could collect all 32 of the treasured items, and then you can restart the game again. Other games that had narrative, Donkey Kong is one. Not a lot of narrative there, but Pauline is taken by Donkey Kong, taken up through levels of these rafters, and not quite named Mario yet, Jumpman has to follow them and save Pauline. There's no end to this one. It's also a closed circuit, but it's got more of a narrative than most games of the time did. And then there was also Pac-Man again. Pac-Man is actually the first game to ever include a cutscene in its video games. Basically, once you won a level, Pac-Man would chase the ghost off or be chased off the ghost, and then brought back. He was a bigger Pac-Man that just chased them off the screen and starts the next level. And then you get sequels to Pac-Man. There was Mrs. Pac-Man, which she is the first female protagonist in video games. And hers included a love story. So Act 1, they meet. Act 2, they fall in love. And in Act 3, they have a kid. And Pac-Man Jr. actually also gets his own video game later down the line. So that's just a look into in game narratives that already exist within the game itself. And then there's the experimental narrative. So, this is how players consumed and reacted to the game itself and the game's impact on the public. So, the biggest one of the time was the start of competitive gaming. So this was something video game designers didn't really consider at the time, you know? The game was designed for you to play for maybe like 2 to 3 minutes. You would lose, you put in more quarters. That's how games made their money. And then you get people that like really wanted to win. People who bragged about their high scores and just essentially destroyed these games. Quite literally, these games were not meant for people to play for a long amount of time. So the longer you played these games that just allegedly ran on loops, you would get kill screens where basically the game would break because it can't process how far of a level you are. Um, Pac-Man did this on level 256. The game would glitch out and shut off. And Donkey Kong did this at level 117. As Jumpman is going up the rafters, he just suddenly dies and your game restarts. And these types of competitions and challenges, people who had at home consoles wanted these as well. So companies began giving real world prizes for reaching certain levels. A good example of this is Activision. They would actually send patches to gamers if they could send pictures and proof that they reached certain parts of the game. And this was like a really cool marketing tool. There was a sense of uh, pride that gamers would get from having this merch, from having these high scores, and it created a sense of community. Um, and it created these tournaments, competitions, and all of this led to actually more development of sophisticated games. So you get a good example of this is Defender. So Defender, when it was made, many people thought the game was actually too difficult and that it wouldn't sell. But the game was designed so it couldn't be broken by skilled gamers. And it's actually believed that the difficulty of the game increased its sales. It sold 5,000 cabinets, and it was one of the first scrolling games that you got. So, another good example that I can think of off the top of my head of a scrolling game is, funny enough, Flappy Bird, where the game scrolls and you move your character with it as it just goes. And another example is when Google Chrome loses Wi Fi and you get to play the dinosaur game. That is a perfect example of a scrolling game. All of this goes to say, classic games at the time, even though they don't have this expansive narrative story like we do now, where we have these gigantic sandbox games, we have 40 plus hour video games that just take forever to complete. These games still had stories and they still had an impact on society, right? Um, while classic video games are commonly known for their simplicity, they still offer complete in game narratives and corrections to their other texts. Players generated additional narratives from their encounters and engagement with these games, as well as predictable game outcomes. A quote from Michael Zalit is that Golden Age games need to be seen in their own right as belonging to their own historical context and not simply precursors of immersive, expansive first person online games. And I agree. Games that we have today are leaps and bounds beyond and different what was made back then. Um, and one of the first shifts of that came after the Great Crash of 1983. To understand the Great Crash, you need to understand how much there was. Back in the 1970s, 1980s, the video game industry was brand new and people didn't really understand how the market worked and what people were looking for. So it just seemed like easy ways to profit off this. And you see this in how many, like, movie video games they made, how many like commercial video games they made. Apparently, Quaker Oats, the oatmeal brand, had their own video game department for a while. Um, it began to blur the line between games and marketing, and companies wouldn't really catch on to that. They just thought this would be a way to promote products, so they would commission pretty poorly made games, but consoles had to compete against each other because there was just an oversaturation of bad games, and there was a lot of consoles on the market that were being outbid by computers. Um, Consoles at the time were not cheap. An Atari, back when it was released in 1977, sold for $189.95. If you translate that, calculate for inflation into 2021 dollars, that's an 811 and 23-cent game console. That is just beyond what most people can spend. So not only were consoles having to compete against each other, they had to compete against these computers that could do a lot more and was cheaper. Like video games had one function. They played games. Computers were able to be like multifunctional. They had word processors, spreadsheets, and video games. And like I said, there were just so many consoles to choose from. Frogger itself could be played on 8 different consoles. And the solution that a certain company had named Atari was to push as many games out as possible. So they rushed so many games. Um, One of the biggest losses they had was the Pac-Man game. So the Pac-Man game, it was the first adaptation of Pac-Man from arcade to console. And Atari rushed the heck out of this game. They also had about 10 million consoles sold. They printed 12 million games because they assumed that this game would convince other people to buy more Ataris 2600, and that people would buy more Pac-Man games. So they already shot themselves in the foot by making more games than they needed. And when the game came out, it was absolutely busted. People couldn't play it, and it got returned en masse. So because of that, Atari started losing about 500 million and was bleeding about $2 million a day. And then came the ET game, the infamous ET game, which I Atari paid $21 million for the right to make this game. A game that should have taken months to make, they made in 5 weeks. And they hyped up this game. They made 5 million copies of it, but only 1 million of it sold. And then many were being returned en masse. And Atari, running out of money, had nothing to do with these games. They tried burning them at first, but when that became a health hazard, it didn't really work. They just buried them in the middle of New Mexico, in these landfills out there, where no one could touch them, no one could look at them again. And it's just after that, after this oversaturation of markets, people lost faith in video game consoles. They weren't buying them anymore. Many people were selling theirs off, returning them. And this hit consoles very hard, but it didn't really touch computers because computers are multifunctional. So for a while, it seemed like computer gaming was going to be the next big thing of gaming. Eventually, it would be. There's plenty of PC gamers today. But what stopped that, what stopped computers from being the next big thing was Nintendo. Nintendo had sat back quietly on the sidelines, just sort of watching this happen. All of Atari and everything broke down. So Nintendo came forward, and launched the NES. They designed the NES to look as little like a game console as possible. They actually tried to make it appear like a VHS, which is seen as like a more sophisticated design. And through that, and through being very picky about who is able to make games for their consoles, they built back up public trust. And then Sega came out with Sonic, and Nintendo had Castlevania, and Metroid, and the rest is history. Um, we have the game market we have today that's full of subcultures. I mean, you have MMOs where there's just references that you don't get if you're not in those groups. Uh, Discords that are made. My dad plays World of Warcraft, and he is constantly on talking about how he talks on Discord with his raid members, and this all started from classical video games and arcades that already had its sense of community as well. Um, to sum it all up, to sum it all up, classic video games are the start of the game industry. They kickstarted into gear, they created the basis of what we have today. But to only look at them and say that was just precursors to this and not dig into the cultural phenomena that video games truly were at the time is doing them a disservice. Because some of those games even exist today. I remember playing Frogger as a kid, and that was way before my time, along with Pac Man. Um, I believe even Pac Man had a 2012 or 2013 TV show that came out. I mean, these aren't things of the past, and people still have nostalgia for these games. So these communities didn't die, they just kept the good ones around. Um, but it's always good to know what goes wrong. And it was the just oversaturation of quick to make, easy cash money grab games. And there's certainly plenty wrong with the gaming industry. Um, but gaming overall brings communities together, um, and can create identities. And if I ever make more episodes of this podcast, I definitely will be going into those topics because video games is just something that I absolutely love. Gaming in general is something that I love, and it deserves to be talked about, and it deserves to be looked at through an archaeological lens. So, I hope you all enjoyed this podcast. This is Peach signing off. See you around.